On a crowded red-line subway car cutting through downtown Chicago, a woman in a tailored cream dress steps in her titanium crutches, striking the metal floor with a sharp, deliberate rhythm. Conversations die. Eyes drop. She scans the rows for a seat. At the far end sits Caleb Morgan, a single father in a worn gray jacket staring at nothing. She walks straight toward him, stops, and looks down at the empty space beside him. "Is this seat taken?" He lifts his head. Their eyes meet, and in that single second, Serena Holt freezes. The freeze lasted maybe 2 seconds, long enough for a man across the aisle to notice, and then she controlled her face the way she'd trained herself to control everything else, and lowered herself onto the bench beside Caleb Morgan. He didn't slide over because there was already room. He just nodded once the way men nod when they don't want to talk, and don't want to be rude either. The train lurched forward, and she set the crutches across her knees, the titanium tapping softly against the buckle of her bag. Her eyes stayed on the window, but Caleb could feel her glance return to his jacket, to the small, worn patch stitched onto the chest pocket. Faded threads. A logo most people wouldn't recognize anymore. A circle, a stylized H, a stylized M, Holt Biomechanics. A subsidiary that hadn't existed in 9 years. Beneath the logo and stitching gone almost gray with age was a 3-character series mark, C06. The original calibration team. There had only ever been 6 of those patches issued in the world. Caleb didn't notice her noticing. He was thinking about the shift report he hadn't filed, and the bracket he was supposed to weld back onto a compressor by noon. He was a single father, and most of his thinking happened in lists. Serena Holt did not look at him again for the rest of the ride. 6:15. Every weekday morning, Caleb caught the same train at the 63rd Street station. Same car, same end seat. He worked maintenance for a mid-sized industrial firm in the Loop, the kind of job where nobody knew his last name, but everyone knew his hands could fix anything. He'd been there 11 years, and he'd learned somewhere along the way that staying invisible cost less than being seen. Chicago in early March was the color of wet concrete. He read no books on the train and didn't scroll his phone. He sat at the end of the row and watched the windows turn from dark to gray, to that thin, washed-out white that meant another day starting. He had never seen the woman before. What he didn't know was that Serena Holt had been taking the same line at the same time for 1 full week, riding in the next car. Forward, studying the layouts and the schedules and the rhythm of the city she'd built half her empire in, but had never really lived inside. 3 years earlier, a charter plane had gone down in light snow near Aspen. 2 people had survived. One of them had walked out. The other had been pulled from the wreckage with most of her right leg gone below the knee and her left ankle shattered into 31 pieces. The press had called it a comeback when she returned to Holt Dynamics 6 months later. They had used the word miracle in headlines, and she had hated that word with the precise, contained hatred of someone who knew the difference between miracle and engineering. She didn't ride the train because she had to. She rode it because her physical therapist had told her very gently that her world had narrowed to boardrooms and town cars, and that this was not the same thing as recovery. That morning, she had finally boarded the second car, and she had seen the patch on a stranger's jacket, and the series mark stitched underneath it, and she had recognized both. For the rest of that ride, she said nothing. At the Lake Street stop, Caleb stood. He had to step around her crutches to reach the door, and he did it without comment, the way he might step around a piece of luggage. She watched him go. He didn't look back. She didn't get off until 2 stations later, and her assistant Logan Brooks was waiting at the curb with the car. Evelyn had been with Holt Dynamics since Serena's 2nd year as CEO, and was the only person in the company who still spoke to her as if she were a person. "You're late," Evelyn said, "by 11 minutes. "I know." The board moved the quarterly to 9. "I know." Evelyn watched her settle into the back seat and adjust the crutches against the door. "Is everything all right?" Serena did not answer the question directly, Instead, she said, "I need you to find someone for me." Quietly. A man about 40. Gray jacket, navy work pants, steel-toed boots. He rides the Red Line northbound and gets off at Lake. He has an old Holt Biomechanics patch on his chest pocket. The series mark is C06. Evelyn's eyebrows didn't move. That was one of the reasons she still had her job. C06 was the original calibration team, she said. 6 engineers, the ones who built the prototype. I'm aware. Anything else? Serena watched the city slide past the tinted glass. Find out where he works. Don't approach him. The next morning, Caleb sat in the same seat. The doors opened at 47th, then Garfield, then 63rd. At 63rd Place, she stepped on. Same dress in a different color, same crutches, same controlled walk. She moved the length of the car and sat down beside him. He looked up, recognized her, and did the exact same nod he'd done the day before, slightly tired, slightly polite. He didn't ask why she'd chosen the same seat, and he didn't say good morning. She didn't either. A businessman across the aisle watched them for a station and a half before losing interest. A college student 2 rows down put in his earbuds. The car rocked, the lights flickered once at the tunnel mouth, and her crutches clicked softly against the bag again. This time, the sound was different to Caleb. He had spent his life listening to titanium, and he could tell from one tap whether a piece had been machined right or hammered together by someone in a hurry. Hers had been machined right. He glanced at the way she held her right knee slightly higher than her left, the way someone holds a knee that isn't entirely their own. He looked away before she could catch him. She caught him anyway. She always caught everything. Around Cermak, her phone vibrated in her bag. She lifted it to her ear without pulling it free. "I'll be in by 9, Evelyn," she said, voice low. "Move the 11 o'clock if you have to." Then the phone was back in the bag, and she was looking out the window again. Caleb did not turn his head, but he heard the name. He filed it the way he filed serial numbers without thinking about why. When the train pulled into Lake Street, he stood. He stepped around her crutches. Before he passed her, he said, "Have a good one." It came out flat, almost mechanical, the kind of thing you say to a stranger you've decided is not a threat. She answered, "You too." He stepped off, the doors closed, and she rode 3 stops further than she needed to that morning. She was thinking about the patch and the nod, and the fact that the man hadn't once looked at her crutches with curiosity or pity, which was something she had not experienced from a stranger in 3 years. By the end of the week, she had ridden that car on 5 consecutive mornings. She had sat next to him on 4 of them. They had exchanged 13 words total. None of them mattered. All of them mattered. On Friday afternoon, Evelyn placed a thin folder on Serena's desk and waited. The folder contained a photograph, a name, an address, and a 1-page work history. Caleb Morgan, 41 years old, maintenance technician at a small industrial firm called Brackett and Hoyle. 11 years on the job. No criminal record, no debt of note, no public profile. The bottom of the page listed his prior employment from 2010 to 2015. He had worked as a calibration engineer at Holt Biomechanics on the prosthetics line. The note next to the dates read, "Senior Team, Series C06, 1 of 6. Serena read the line twice. Then she closed the folder and looked at Evelyn. "He worked the original sleeve," Evelyn said quietly. "He was one of the 6 who built the prototype you're wearing." "I know. Do you want me to do anything else?" Serena ran her thumb along the edge of the folder. "No, don't follow up. Don't contact him. Don't put his name in any internal system." Evelyn nodded once and left. That same Friday, 6:12 in the morning, the train pulled into Lake Street, and Caleb stood and stepped around the crutches and stopped at the door. He turned his head just slightly. Same time Monday. Serena looked up at him, and the corner of her mouth moved by maybe a millimeter. Not a smile, the shape of one. Same time Monday. He stepped off. The doors closed behind him, and neither of them yet understood that they had just agreed to something neither of them could walk away from. Monday came in cold and gray. Caleb boarded the red line at 6:12, took the seat at the end of the row, and at 63rd place, the doors opened, and Serena stepped on. She walked the length of the car the way she had walked it the week before, sat down beside him, set the crutches across her knees and said, "Good morning." He answered, "Morning." That was all. For the next 3 mornings the pattern repeated. They rode in a silence that had stopped being awkward and had started being something else, something neither of them named. She was learning the rhythm of his hands the way he flexed them on his thighs to keep the joints loose. He was learning the rhythm of her breathing, the small adjustments she made when the train hit an uneven stretch of rail. People stared at her. People always stared at her. She didn't react. And after a while, Caleb noticed that her not reacting was its own kind of reacting. A discipline so complete it looked like indifference, but wasn't. On Wednesday morning, a heavy-set man in a wool coat boarded at Roosevelt and stood directly in front of them holding the pole. He looked at Serena's crutches, then at her face, then at her crutches again. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Caleb watched her. Her chin lifted maybe 1/4 of an inch. Her shoulders did not move. The man got off at Monroe, and the moment the doors closed behind him, Serena exhaled through her nose the smallest sound, and Caleb understood for the first time that the cost of her composure was being paid in real currency every minute, every stop. Later that same ride between Harrison and Jackson, she shifted her weight once, and her jaw tightened in a way she did not allow her face to show. Her right hand moved briefly toward the top of her residual limb, just a finger's pressure through the fabric of the dress, and then back to her lap. Caleb saw it and pretended he hadn't. The motion lasted half a second. He had seen patients do it on the testing floor at biomechanics. It was the gesture of someone whose sleeve was rubbing wrong, who was going to have a problem if they didn't get it looked at in the next day or two. He didn't say anything. It was not his place. The next morning, a woman in a navy peacoat boarded at Garfield and sat directly across from them. Her name was Diane Carter, though neither Caleb nor Serena would learn that until later. She rode the red line 3 days a week to her sister's bakery in Uptown. She had a large, open face and the kind of voice that carried whether she meant it to or not. She watched Serena for 2 stations. Then she leaned forward, smiled, and said, "I'm sorry, but I have to ask. Are you who I think you are?" Serena's eyes moved to her. Caleb felt the temperature of the bench change. "I'm not sure who you think I am," Serena said. "Holt Dynamics," Diane said. "You're Serena Holt. I saw you on the cover of Forbes must have been 4 years ago. My husband still has the issue somewhere." She laughed the laugh of someone who didn't realize a conversation could be unwelcome. "I knew it. I told myself the second you sat down. I said that woman built a company worth $9 billion on a red line train at 7 in the morning. Imagine that." A man 2 rows down lifted his head. The college student took out an earbud. The car, which had been moving in its usual indifference, pivoted toward them in the small, ugly way that public spaces pivot when something becomes interesting. Serena's face didn't change. "You have a good memory," she said. "I do," Diane said, pleased. "I read everything. The accident, all of that. It's a miracle what they did with that prosthetic. It really is. You can hardly tell. I mean, you can tell, of course, with the crutches, but the leg, my goodness." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, low and quick. He kept his eyes on the floor. "Thank you," Serena said. The single word came out the same temperature as the metal of the door handle. Diane looked at Caleb, then friendly curious. "And you? Are you family?" Caleb shook his head once. "No, ma'am." "Just a fellow passenger," Serena said. Diane nodded, as if she'd expected something more interesting, and was making her peace with the disappointment. The train slowed for Jackson, and she stood and gathered her bag. Before she stepped off, she looked back at Serena and said, "Well, it's an honor. Really." Then the doors closed, and she was gone. The car returned to its normal noise. The college student put his earbud back in. The man 2 rows down lost interest and went back to his phone. But the air around the two of them had changed. Caleb could feel it. Serena had been a stranger on a bench. Now she was $9 billion on a bench, and the difference was not academic. Caleb stared at the floor for a full minute. Then he said very quietly, without turning his head, "I worked the calibration line at biomechanics, 2010 through 15. The seal sleeve, the carbon collar." He stopped. "I think that's what's on you, or the version they finished after I left." Serena did not answer for a long moment. When she did, her voice was different. Lower. "It is, I figured," Caleb said. "I could hear it." He looked at her, then just briefly. "First day you sat down, the crutches, then the way you moved when the car braked." He looked back at the floor. "I didn't say anything because it wasn't my business." She studied his face. He could feel it. "When did you leave?" "They restructured in 15. I took severance and went to maintenance. Pay was about the same, and the hours were better." He shrugged just one shoulder. "I'm sorry about what happened to you." "Don't be." Her voice had a clean edge to it. "It happened. I'm still here." He nodded. He didn't say anything else. That afternoon in the 38th floor conference room of Holt Tower, a man named Marcus Whitfield called a closed session meeting of 3 board members. Whitfield was the company's chief operating officer and had been at Holt Dynamics for 12 years, the last 7 of them spent absorbing the institutional knowledge of every department under Serena's authority. He had a smile that worked on cameras and a memory that worked on people. He had been waiting, with the slow patience of a man who understood compounding for a moment of weakness. The accident had given him 3 years of weakness to work with. He'd built his case carefully, like a man laying tile. He had medical projections from a consultant Serena had never approved. He had quiet conversations with 2 division heads who'd grown frustrated with her decision speed since the recovery. He had, most importantly, the recent neurology report leaked to him from a clinic she'd visited in February, indicating chronic phantom limb pain that had not responded to standard intervention. He told the 3 board members, in a voice carefully calibrated for concern, that Serena's condition was deteriorating and that the company's exposure was no longer acceptable. He used words like fiduciary and compassion in the same sentence. He proposed a transition, quiet, dignified, generous, effective at the next quarterly meeting 3 weeks out. The 3 board members did not commit. They didn't say no either. That was enough for Whitfield. He had what he needed. That evening, Caleb's supervisor at Brackett and Hale stopped him in the parking lot. There was a guy the supervisor said, a guy who'd called the front office that afternoon. Said he was doing background work for a corporate account. Asked specifically about Caleb. Asked whether Caleb had been on the red line lately. Asked whether he'd been talking to anyone. The supervisor had told him nothing because the supervisor didn't know anything, but he wanted Caleb to be aware. Caleb thanked him. He drove home in silence, with his hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel. The next morning, Friday, he sat in his usual seat. The doors opened at 63rd Place. They closed. Serena did not get on. He told himself she had a meeting, or a doctor, or a different routine that day. He rode to Lake Street, stepped off, and went to work. He fixed a malfunctioning compressor and ate his lunch alone in the break room, and did not think about her, except for the 7 or 8 times he did. He thought about the small motion he'd seen, the finger pressure at the top of the residual limb, and he understood what it probably meant. She didn't come Monday. She didn't come Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, the seat beside him was just a seat again, and he understood what the absence meant, even if he didn't yet know the shape of it. On Wednesday afternoon, a man approached him outside the loading bay of Brackett and Hale. The man had a clean coat and a careful manner, and asked if Caleb had a moment. He said his name and the name of his firm. Neither name meant anything to Caleb. The man said he was working with a client who had an interest in Ms. Serena Holt's well-being. He said there were concerns. He said the client wanted to know whether in Caleb's recent interactions with her, she had appeared confused, or fatigued, or unsteady. Just an honest answer, he said. They were trying to do the right thing. Caleb looked at the man for a long second. Then he said, "I don't know who you mean." He turned and walked back into the loading bay. That night, he sat in his kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and replayed the conversation. He had spent 11 years staying invisible. He knew the shape of a setup when one walked up to him in a parking lot. They were not trying to do the right thing. They were trying to build a record, and they were using him as a brick. He thought about her composure on the train, the discipline of it, the man in the wool coat, the way her chin had lifted that quarter of an inch, the half-second pressure of a finger at the top of the sleeve. He thought about the patch on his jacket and the carbon collar, and what it meant that someone with her kind of money was riding a public train at 6 in the morning in the first place. She hadn't been bored. She had been looking for something. She had been gone for 6 days now. The man in the parking lot had come on the 6th. That was not a coincidence. Whatever was happening to her was happening fast. He didn't have her number. He didn't have an address. He didn't have anything except a station and a time, and she wasn't using either anymore. He sat in the kitchen until the radiator clicked off, and the apartment went cold around him, and for the first time in a long time. He understood that staying invisible was no longer the cheaper choice. He didn't sleep much. By 4 in the morning, he had written down everything the man in the parking lot had said, the firm's name, the date, the time. He had also written down the man's face in the small, careful handwriting of someone who used to log calibration data. Around 5, he made a second cup of coffee and looked at what he had. It wasn't a lot. It was enough to be a brick. It wasn't enough to break a wall. What he did have was something the man in the parking lot didn't know he had. He had ridden beside her for 9 mornings. He had watched her cross a moving train car on titanium crutches without missing a step. He had heard the sleeve seat correctly every single time. He knew the difference between a prosthetic that was failing its user and a prosthetic that was carrying her perfectly. And he knew that if anyone was building a case that her health was deteriorating, that case was either being fabricated or being read off a piece of paper by people who'd never seen her stand. He got to work at 6:30 and asked his supervisor for a personal day. The supervisor said yes without looking up. Caleb spent his lunch break in the break room with his phone finding the public address of Holt Tower on Wacker. He didn't know how he was going to get past a lobby. He didn't know who he was going to ask for. He had one name, the one he had heard her say into a phone on a train weeks earlier, and he had filed it without knowing why. Evelyn. He wrote it down. That afternoon, he walked into the lobby of Holt Tower in his work jacket, the one with the patch on the chest. He told the woman at the security desk that he had information for an Evelyn who worked with Miss Holt regarding a matter she would be aware of. He said his name was Caleb Morgan. He said he had been on the C06 calibration team at Holt Biomechanics. He said he could wait. The woman looked at him for a measured second, looked at the patch, and picked up the phone. 11 minutes later, Evelyn came down. He recognized her without ever having seen her, because she walked the way someone walks when they're carrying a fire and trying not to show it. She stopped 2 feet from him, looked at the patch on his jacket, and looked at his face. "Mr. Morgan." "Yes, ma'am." "How did you know to ask for me?" "You called her once on the train. She said your name out loud." It was the truth, and a small one, and Evelyn knew it was. "What do you have?" He told her. He told her about the man in the parking lot, the firm, the questions about Serena's confusion and fatigue, the way the questions had been shaped to harvest a particular kind of answer. He told her he hadn't given that answer. He told her he had ridden beside Serena for 9 mornings, and that whatever someone was telling her board about her condition was not what he had observed. He told her he had built the carbon collar in the prosthetic she was using, or the version of it that became the version she was using, and that he could speak to its function in a clinical setting if it would help. Evelyn listened without moving. When he finished, she said, "There's a board vote in 6 days. 3 weeks out, I was told by someone who would know. It was 3 weeks out yesterday." Her voice did not rise. "It was moved this morning. It is now 6 days." Caleb absorbed that. Then they know something is coming. Then they're trying to land it before something can. She watched him. "Why are you here, Mr. Morgan?" He thought about it carefully. "Because she sat down next to me when nobody else would, and I don't think people get to do what's being done to her without somebody saying something." Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Wait here. Don't move." She came back 22 minutes later with a different kind of expression on her face, and a man in a dark gray suit who introduced himself as the head of Serena's outside counsel. They took Caleb to a conference room on the 34th floor. Serena was not in the building. Serena had been at home for 7 days on her doctor's recommendation, recovering from a soft tissue infection at the residual limb that had nothing to do with phantom pain and nothing to do with her ability to lead, and that Whitfield had described to the board as a hospitalization. Over the next 4 hours, Caleb gave a recorded statement. He named the firm, described the man, and gave the exact date and approximate time of the contact. He described the questions in order. He explained in clear, non-technical language what the carbon collar did and how it failed and what failure looked like, and how to tell the difference between an unsteady user and an unsteady device. He let counsel ask him every question they wanted. He answered all of them. While he was doing this, Evelyn was on the phone with 2 other people who had been approached by the same firm in the past 3 weeks, both of whom had not given the answer Whitfield wanted, either both of whom had not realized what they were being asked until Evelyn called them. By 8 that evening, counsel had affidavits from all 3. By midnight, they had a chain of payments from a discretionary account Whitfield controlled to the firm in question, surfaced from accounting by a junior auditor Evelyn trusted. By the following Monday, they had everything they needed. The board meeting was held on a Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock in the same 38th floor conference room where Whitfield had given his careful presentation 2 weeks earlier. Serena was there. She had asked to attend. She wore a dark blue suit and used the crutches because she had decided she was done pretending the crutches were optional. She sat at the head of the table. Whitfield made his presentation again, the same one he'd been refining for years. The medical projections the consultants read of the neurology report, the fiduciary language. 2 of the 3 board members he had cultivated nodded at the appropriate moments. The other one, a woman named Margaret Doyle, did not. When he finished, Serena's counsel placed a folder in front of each board member. Inside was the chain of payments, the affidavits, the recorded statement of a former Holt biomechanics calibration engineer named Caleb Morgan. The room read in silence. Whitfield's face did the thing faces do when they are still smiling, but the smile has become structural. He started to speak. Margaret Doyle held up one finger, and he stopped. Serena didn't say much. She didn't need to. She said, "I would like a vote on Mr. Whitfield's continued role effective today." The vote was 7-1. Whitfield himself voted against. Then he gathered his folder and left the room and the building, and by the end of the week, the firm he had hired had been named in 2 state inquiries. That afternoon, Serena asked Evelyn to bring Caleb up. He came in his same gray jacket. The conference room had emptied. She was sitting in the chair at the head of the table, the crutches against the wall behind her. She looked tired in a way she had not allowed herself to look on the train. "Mr. Morgan." "Ma'am, sit down." He did. She studied him across the table. "I want to thank you. I want to say it out loud in this room where the rest of it happened, because I think it matters where things are said." "You don't owe me a thank you," he said. "I just told them what I saw. You walked into a building you've never been in and put your name on a statement against a man with money and a long memory. That is not nothing." Her voice didn't rise. I would like to offer you a position, senior calibration, a team of your own. You'd be working on the next generation sleeve, the one I'd be wearing in 3 years if it works." He thought about it. He thought about it for what felt like a long time, although it wasn't really. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I think I'd like to keep my job." She watched his face. "May I ask why?" "Because I've spent a long time being a person nobody notices, and I'm not sure I'd be good at being a person who's being watched." He looked at the table, then back at her. "And because I think you and I should be the people who sat next to each other on a train. I don't know that we'd still be that if I worked here." She considered it. Then for the first time he had ever seen, she smiled. Not the shape of one. A real one, small and quick. "Same time Monday?" "Same time Monday." He stood up. He walked to the door. Before he opened it, he turned back. "The collar," he said. "The version you're wearing. It's good work. Whoever finished it after I left, they did it right." "I know," she said. "I had a good team." He nodded once and left. The next Monday, at 6:12, the red line pulled into 63rd place. The doors opened. Serena Holt stepped on. She walked the length of the car, sat down beside Caleb Morgan, set her crutches across her knees, and said, "Good morning." "Morning." The train moved. A man across the aisle looked at her crutches and looked away. The car rocked, and the city slid past the window the color of wet concrete. 2 stations later, an elderly woman boarded, carrying 2 heavy grocery bags, and stood near the door holding the railing with one hand. Caleb saw her before Serena did. He stood up and offered his seat. The woman thanked him and took it. Caleb moved down the car and held a different pole, and at Lake Street he stepped off and went to work, and Serena rode 3 more stops to a meeting that had been on her calendar for 7 days. Nobody on that train knew what either of them did for a living. Nobody knew that one of them owned $9 billion of a company, and the other one fixed compressors for $43 an hour. Nobody knew that the woman with the titanium crutches had almost lost everything 2 weeks earlier, and had kept it because a man in a gray jacket had walked into a lobby with nothing but his name and what he had seen. The train moved north, the way it had every morning, the way it would the next morning, and the morning after that. The seat at the end of the row was occupied. The seat beside it was occupied. And the smallest, quietest decision a stranger had once made to nod yes instead of no had turned out to be the decision the rest of the story was built on.